Internet, recently I did something very out of character for me. I watched a movie. I will give you a minute to recover from your shock and awe. Actually, I watched two movies, and I didn't intentionally watch them together or choose a theme for movies that I planned to watch this week or anything. I just sort of organically stumbled across these two movies at the same time and discovered after the fact that they were really interesting to think and talk about in contrast to each other. The films in question are Rocky. That's the first one before the franchise got all full of itself and started trying to rewrite the history of the Cold War, and Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials. That's the second one, after the franchise got all full of itself and tried to rewrite the history of itself to make it look as though it in any way deserved three movies. I would argue, in fact, that these two movies are the opposite of each other in a few regards, the most interesting of which is one that I want to talk to you about this week, namely that Rocky has an amazing, compelling stories with rich characters and improbable victories and all of those things that make for a good story, but has lots of flaws in how the story is delivered, while Maze Runner has an absolutely garbage story but a spectacular editing team, and so its mechanics are pretty much flawless. I thought this contrast would be cool to discuss, not just because I get to trash a movie that I hated and punch its young and therefore presumably obnoxious fanbase's collective face with a classic piece of cinema until they say uncle, but because it is an interesting study of the role that movie formulas play in how you experience a film. My brief recap will be a bit long this week because of its double-headed nature. Please bear with me. Rocky, for those of you whose familiarity with films goes no further than they've got pictures, I hear they move, but that sounds like bullshit, and maybe sound. Do they have sound? And also, maybe for the benefit of foreign audiences, but I don't think it's ethnocentric of me to speculate that Rocky has found its way beyond US borders, at least to a greater extent than this blog has, was a low-budget drama written and starring Sylvester Stallone that, for legal purposes, absolutely does not dramatize the true-life story of Chuck Wepner, an underachieving boxer who, in a 1975 title fight, went 15 rounds with then-world champion Muhammad Ali, scoring a knockdown against the champ before losing by technical knockout. In the film, our titular hero, Rocky Balboa, is an underclass boxer who is on the verge of retiring following a disappointing career of circling cheap clubs and disreputable opponents when he is approached by representation of the champion, Apollo Creed, seeking an opponent for the World Heavyweight Championship fight. Rocky reluctantly agrees and with a grim determination resolves to prove himself by going the distance with the champ, a goal he plans to achieve through the hopelessly misguided tactic of training relentlessly under the tutelage of his experienced and worldly manager Mickey. In the film's climax, the two pugilists endure a brutal 15-round battle, culminating in Creed's victory by judges' decision. A triumph for Rocky as he proves that he has what it takes to hang with the champ. Major spoilers for Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials, a relatively recent film, are coming up. You have been warned. Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials is the second in a series of books of the same name whose original installment established a Hunger Games-style death tournament for children, where a group of teenagers have their memories wiped and are dropped into a killer obstacle course. In the second film, they have been rescued from the maze, and it is revealed that they are involved in a zombie apocalypse, and that the torture to which we, the audience, were the teenagers, were subjected to in the first film was some sort of experiment, of which they were the focus because, as is revealed in this movie, they are immune to the virus. They soon learn that their rescuers are actually their captors in disguise, and plan to put them into some sort of nightmarish living dead state so as to harvest them. They break away and have to survive an arduous trek across the hellish, post-apocalyptic desert populated by zombies as they seek greener pastures with a resistance group supposedly living in the mountains. They have a run-in with Gus from Breaking Bad along the way, who takes a break from dealing meth and threatening Nobel laureates to help them out of a scrape with some of the villains from the Book of Eli and deliver them to the resistance group in the hopes of some compensation. Everything that happens from meeting Gus to finding the resistance group is just stock scenes from post-apocalyptic movies, zombie movies, and Mad Max movies all mashed together, so I'll skip ahead. Once they believe themselves to be safe among the resistance and the heights of some nondescript mountain range. Oh yeah, this movie cheats at geography a lot, so it's best not to worry about where they actually are. One of the children turns on the others and calls in the evil military group, which, by the way, is named Wicked, an acronym of some sort, because they have absolutely no sense of PR. I mean, come on. Wicked comes and takes one of them hostage. The film ends on a stirring speech by our main character, who I assume is the titular character because it's singular, Maze Runner, and he runs a lot. And he resolves to go back and rescue Richard Pennsylvania from the TV show Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, and I assume that we will pick up on that plot thread in the next movie. Jesus, I'm exhausted. Where was I going with this? Ah yes, the delivery. You see, there are certain rules that one has to follow when telling or writing a story, and there are even more rules for stories that are going into a screenplay. These rules don't all pertain to the content of your story, and they're not really there to police the content, honestly. They're there to police the structure and efficiency so as to make certain guarantees about how easy and pleasurable it is to consume some piece of media. They're by no means sacred, and it is certainly possible to deviate from them and still create something that is readable, watchable, fun, etc. For instance, there's a rule that you can't, or rather shouldn't, write scenes in a book or movie that aren't immediately necessary. Often an author or a screenplay writer will have an idea in their head for a thing that they want to write because it's fun for them. Maybe they have a lot of wordplay they'd like to express, or some kung fu they'd like to see, but in the grand scheme there isn't any need for it. It doesn't serve the plot, it doesn't provide unique and necessary characterization, what have you. The scene in The Matrix Reloaded where Neo has to fight Seraph because you do not truly know someone until you fight them, which is utter horseshit, is extraneous and pointless, and we all kind of feel it. Look, I love some kung fu as much as the next guy, but I don't know who Seraph is, I don't know his motivations, I don't know his abilities. The fight holds no stakes. That scene probably should have been cut pretty early on in editing. Quentin Tarantino, on the other hand, will often write a scene that's mostly just dialogue, sometimes between pretty minor characters, that isn't about anything, and it's not really important, like the opening scene in Reservoir Dogs in which a number of mobsters argue around a table in a cheap diner about whether or not it's appropriate to tip. And on the whole, those feel perfectly justified being there. Why? Because Tarantino's the king of dialogue, and those scenes feel like they move along, they're fun to watch, they're fun to listen to, and they form long double entendres that poke at society as a whole, and his movies aren't all that long to begin with, and are all about tension, atmosphere, and double entendres that poke at society. Now, why does any of this matter with respect to the movies at hand? Well, because together they're a good case study about the efficiency and structure of story writing. Let me preface what I'm about to say before the internet shits all over me. I love the first Rocky movie. It's a spectacular piece of cinema, and this isn't coming from nostalgia. I saw this movie for the first time last week. It's just an objectively excellent film. Please bear that in mind when I drop this bombshell on you. Rocky is flawed out the ass, and its flaws lay mostly in its structure and efficiency. For instance, there is a rule in story writing that your story has to quickly establish a central conflict, and then everything has to be about that conflict, and I mean everything. A story goes like this. Person goes up a tree, people throw rocks at them, person comes down, having changed. Are you with me so far? Alright, so everything that happens in that story has to be about that person going up a tree and the resulting events. Whether it's person acting in anticipation of going up the tree, or preparing to go up the tree, or how they actually go up the tree, or the fear they feel once they start, or how betrayed they feel when they get hit by a rock, or how they regret going up the tree because the lowest branch broke and now they know they're going to break an ankle when they come back down. The story has to have focus, and the center of its focus should be the central conflict. The Matrix, for instance, is about Neo freeing himself from the fictional world that has imprisoned him and all of humanity, and coming to terms with his destiny as their savior. Spoilers. So every scene in the movie is about someone trying to get him out of the Matrix, or explaining what the Matrix is and how to fight it, or building up the agents to be super badasses so the stakes are high when Neo fights them later, etc. Once the central conflict is established, everything revolves around it. That's what defines a central conflict. In my first heartbreaking piece of film criticism about a beloved franchise that, let's be clear, I have no business going after. The film and everyone involved in it have already won pop culture, and nothing I can say about it is in any way as relevant nor as significant as the thing itself. But I'm obliged to point out, the film Rocky does not give a shit about this rule. First, the movie makes us wait half a goddamn hour before it even tells us what the central conflict is going to be, and it doesn't get the main character actually involved in it until after the 60-minute point. I swear to God, I'm not exaggerating. We get an hour into this film before the hero of this piece even knows he's in this friggin' story. That's too damned long. Let's compare this to other movies. In the movie Reservoir Dogs, at the 60-minute point, Tim Roth wakes up from his bleeding out induced coma and guns down Michael Madsen, revealing the shocking twist that he is, in fact, the undercover cop who ratted the gang out. Almost exactly 60 minutes into The Terminator, the robot drives a car into the police station and starts gunning down cops in his hunt for Sarah Connor. That's the original I'll be back scene, by the way. 60 minutes into The Last Action Hero, the bad guy, the one with the red hair and the target contact lens, crosses over into the real world. Now, to be clear, I'm not the kind of asshole who watches a movie with a remote in one hand and a stopwatch in the other and rigorously enforces the strict movie timing formula. What happened is that I watched this movie and it felt like for goddamned ever before anything actually motherfucking happened. And there's the crux of the issue. Like I said, the rules aren't sacred. They're in place to make sure that the movie feels smooth and timely to the audience, i.e. me. And when you violate them, the timing can feel palpably off, to me. In the case of Rocky, the movie feels slow and meandering because it spends a lot of time, far too much time, building the world and the characters before it bothers to get the main character involved in the central conflict. And remember, the hero being involved in the central conflict is what we're all here to see. Another way in which Rocky violates this basic tenet of story writing is that it has a whole B-plot that gets pretty much equal screen time to the central conflict, is way less interesting than the central conflict, and in no way connects to the central conflict. I'm speaking, of course, of Paulie's aspiration to become a world-renowned marine biologist exploring the wild frontiers of the deep sea. No, that's a lie. I'm talking about the love story with Adrian, obviously. Now look, I have a lot of problems with the story itself, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to bring any of them up. Instead, I'm going to simply ask this. What does the love story involving Adrian add to the story about Rocky fighting Apollo Creed? Sure, Rocky gets to bounce expositional dialogue off of Adrian. She doesn't need a whole subplot for that. A character like Paulie is just fine for that. Sure, she has a climactic scene where she tells off her overbearing, overprotective older brother, and that brings a logical wrinkle to Paulie's arc. That's fine, and it would totally justify a movie about Adrian. I actually find her a perfectly interesting character. But what does it have to do with Rocky fighting Apollo Creed? Remember, Rocky is going up a tree and Apollo Creed is going to throw rocks at him before he comes down having changed. Does Adrian help him go up the tree? No. Does she throw rocks at him? Decidedly not. Does she help him come down? Not really. She's standing there when he gets down from the tree, sure, and he shouts out to her in the crowd after he gets brutalized in his fight with Creed, but it just doesn't mean anything for the story to have her there or anywhere else where she turns up. Her place in the film almost gets teeth and even purpose when Mickey tells Rocky that he can't go out with her anymore because he's in training, but then nothing ever comes of that. It's an unfired Chekhov's gun, and that fucking irritates me. Look, I don't want this to sound like I'm bashing a guy's first attempt at screenplay writing. The fact is that Rocky very seriously overcomes its flaws by having a tremendous underdog story underpinned by deep, relatable, meaningful characters. It's got guts, glory, triumph against insurmountable odds, full character arcs. It shows me things instead of telling me. It's exactly as good and as classic as everybody says and thinks it is. But it is, at times, hard to watch as a direct result of its structural flaws. Now, let's turn our attention to the other movie whose overlong name I stuck up there in the title. Goodfellas. What's that? I did not put Goodfellas in the title. Damn. What movie did I put there? Maze Runner 2. Ah, shit. Now, let's turn our attention to the other movie whose name I stuck up there in the title. Maze Runner, The Scorch Trials. This particular piece is interesting in that it has the exact opposite problem to Rocky. Namely, its story is shit on a hot tin roof. It's generic, bland, it's aping every single other successful movie but without any regard for their substance or impact. I hate its characters, I hate its attempts at mystery, I hate its shallow appeals to youth, I hate its gaping plot holes, it's unoriginal and fucking stupid. But do you know what it isn't? It isn't poorly paced or poorly structured. In fact, it's so designed by committee that it has all of its rough edges sanded off, and like the edges coming off of a suppository, it actually makes the whole experience a lot more tolerable. For instance, there is something called the therefore rule for story writing, where your story should fall into the general shape, event A happens, therefore event B happens, therefore event C happens, and so on. And Maze Runner II follows this rule to a T, which serves two purposes. First, it ensures that everything that happens in the movie relates to the central conflict, and secondly, it keeps the film from meandering. So even though the events themselves might be stupid, we're strung along at a pretty agreeable pace from one to the next without running off into the weeds, and the whole thing hardly ever feels like it drags. The hero is suspicious of his rescuers, therefore he breaks into a secure area of the facility, therefore he sees a conversation which dumps exposition on him and reveals the first plot twist, which is that he's in danger, therefore he organizes an escape into the Scorch, therefore he runs into zombies, therefore he and his friends resolve to go someplace that might offer them shelter, i.e. the Resistance, therefore they find Gus from Breaking Bad, therefore he decides to bring them to the Resistance, and so on. The obstacles to the plot also follow this pattern. Wicked restores the only girl's memories, therefore she eventually turns to the dark side and calls in an airstrike on them just when they feel like they're safe. Which, by the way, is another example of this movie abiding by movie formula. Whenever things have settled down too much, the movie either throws a new and typically obvious villain at the heroes, or brings back an old one because you can't have a story without conflict, and conflict requires that you have enemies nearby. This, incidentally, is what takes all of the piss and vinegar out of the movie's twists. Its prime mistake there being that it pretends to have actual twists when all it has are events to propel the plot that are obvious due to their necessity and perfect timing. When the girl hands the troop over to Wicked just when they think they're safe, I knew it was coming. First of all, because they had obviously been building her arc toward that, and secondly, because the plot couldn't advance if the heroes and the villains weren't near each other. However, because it's so obviously coming, there's a bit of primal satisfaction when it lands right on time. Like when you're playing Tetris and you make a row disappear. The other thing this movie does that's basically satisfying is that it takes all of the tropes from all of the movie genres that it's plagiarizing and peppers them in at pretty much exactly the right time. The heroes meet a band of post-apocalyptic outlaws just when we start getting sick of their surviving the elements. They meet the sly businessman who is trading human lives for money just when we've accepted that Brenda and Thomas can survive life on the street. We finally find the resistance army just when we're getting sick of looking for them. We get the twist betrayal just when we're ready for peak climax. That is, we've constructed just enough safety to have it all shattered. As if to clue me into the fact that they know I'm judging them on it, the movie even has a stirring speech meant to rally the troops in preparation for a final assault on the enemy as the heroes resolve to run no longer right at the end of this big climactic battle. And A, the speech sucked, and B, I didn't know or care about any of the people that stepped up in response to it. It was this perfect microcosm of the entire film where they have the perfect shape of a rousing moment in an inspiring underdog story, and it is only undercut by the complete lack of substance. It's beautiful, really. At this point, I want to emphasize, for clarity, that Maze Runner 2 is not a good movie. In fact, it's a bad movie, with unlikable characters and a plot that, in addition to going nowhere, has holes you could drive a truck through. What I'm pointing out is simply that this movie feels pretty much perfectly fine going down because it knows the rules for making a palatable, if bad, movie. It's easy on the brain in that regard. It's shaped right. The reason I choose to place it next to Rocky is not because I feel that they're equally good, or that the structure of this piece of garbage makes up for its flaws. In fact, Rocky's flaws are much more readily overcome by its strengths. What I think is interesting is that these two movies, side by side, in a way, say a lot about how a big budget movie with every advantage can suck, while an indie movie with big holes in it can gross over 200 times its budget and win Best Picture. A big budget editing crew and an army of screenwriters have science on their side, and they know and can calculate how to time things, how to conduct music, how to edit shots in such a way that they can relax the part of your brain that absorbs stories, and you won't necessarily throw a fit when the underlying material sucks. A small timer like the Sylvester Stallone that wrote Rocky doesn't necessarily have the advantage of what amounts to an engineering crew going over his script with a fine-tooth comb, making little tiny adjustments until it was absolutely perfect, but he can still put out a masterpiece because he has a story that captures our imagination and makes us feel in a way that gets us to stand up at the end of the movie and cheer. In short, it's got heart, and movies are all about